The cosmos has always been symbolized by the hand. And the quality of Paleolithic art is to have the human hand come in closer, pan in, right there, that's good. The quality in Paleolithic art is to have the hand cinch the horizon of animals. And the animals were the horizon of human life at the time. That is to say, man did not eat grass. He ate meat. He was like a carnivore. This is a distinct difference from man in an earlier horizon, because we know from very early traces of man, say 2 million years ago, man was largely an herbivore. And there was a transformation. And when Homo sapiens came in, Homo sapiens were largely carnivores originally. And so all of the images of life in Paleolithic art do not show the vegetation. You don't see vegetation, but you see the animals upon which life depended. And we can say there's an identification with the animals. Joseph Campbell, in his volumes on the great world mythology, and then pan back a little bit here. Joseph Campbell, in his volumes on world mythology, the first great section of it is called The Way of the Animals. In Paleolithic times, some 40,000 years ago, the central archetypal symbol, the central transforming symbol in the human psyche was the great cave bear. The very earliest cave dwellings are cave dwellings as religious mystery chapels, initiating people into the cult of the great cave bear. Now, the bears lived in caves, and these are not friendly little American brown bears or black bears. These are enormous bears. Let's talk for a second about bears. The only large landscape that still has wild large bears in the world is the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia. And those Siberian brown bears average about 1,500 pounds. A Bengal tiger is about 400 pounds. And so a Kamchatka wild brown bear is 4 times the size of a Bengal tiger. The largest bears on the planet now are Kodiak bears, and they only occur on a little island off Alaska, and those Kodiak bears are about 2,000 pounds. They're as massive as a small car, a pickup truck. I'm trying to give you some idea of the ferocious, titanic reality of mystery religions originally that brought out a sense of awe and wonder in human beings of our species when we first began to cinch, to grasp, to understand a vision. friend of mine many years ago told me about an expedition of hunting Kodiak bears in the 1920s. And there were 3 men, high-powered rifles. And they were on Kodiak Island, and they were working a gully. One man on either side, and my friend, who was a young man at that time, was working the bottom of the gully. And all of a sudden he was cautioned by the man up on the right to hold it right there, that the bear is right in front of him. And he said he could not see it. He looked and he looked. He couldn't see the bear until what he thought was this huge rock, this huge boulder, stood up. It was 11 feet high. And the roar, he said, absolutely petrified you. You couldn't move. And he said there was no question whatsoever that that bear was superior. It was the superior reality of the landscape. And once he established that, without any fear whatsoever, he went back down on all fours and just ambled off. And he said the 3 of them just stood there like boys with toys. The reality of the great cave bear is that they were larger than Kodiak bears. They were enormously ferocious. But it was not the spine-numbing fearfulness that was inspirational about them, but the fact that they went into hibernation every year. They went into the caves and they just simply slept the winter away and only came out in the spring. The Paleolithic Demeter was a cave bear and not a woman. The rebirth symbol was the cave bear and not anything else. And the human hand symbol, which I always use still, that human hand symbol is not so much to grasp and clutch and possess and have, but to say hail. And that greeting, that Paleolithic greeting, that saying hail to the ferocious, mysterious power of life, is at the same time the gift of fearlessness and also a teaching mode. One apprentices oneself to that energy, to that mystery. And whoever bears that energy is worthy of our respect, of our deep regard. In this late junkyard age, teachers have no respect whatsoever. They're paid even less than auto mechanics, and they're functionaries, and it's a disgrace. Brought upon by the fact that very little real reality is taught. There are very few people who can teach in that way, who can hold that hand up like 50,000 years ago and mean that and make that happen. That transformational symbol, that archetype of the self that was the great cave bear, and all the earliest Paleolithic caves where man inhabited them, all have this quality of sanctification. And the altar generally had a skull of a great cave bear. Now, most of those places were at the terminal moraine of receding glaciation, not the latest glaciation that receded 12,000 years ago, but 2 periods of glaciation before that. And those caves at the terminal moraine of that 3 times ice age ago Those caves are all very high in northern European mountain ranges. Towards the end of Joseph Campbell's life, they found a cave at Drakensberg up in the Swiss Alps, and sure enough, there was the skull of the great cave bear and many other transformational artifacts that were available there in the cave. Almost impossible to get to in our age. Vision was always a function of two qualities that interplayed together. And we can trace from 40,000 years ago in a direct line all the way to the Renaissance, 500 years ago, a direct line. And those two qualities had Greek words in the last 3,000 years that we still use. Ipopteia, which meant wide-eyed receptance. We used an example of ancient Sumerian imagery of the wide-eyedness. Come in. Yeah. The wide-eyedness. Ipopteia. It meant a kind of seeing where you're not looking at something, but you're letting that come into your vision. That's what vision is. Vision is not seeing. It's not identifying. In order to see, you have to identify, and that seeing is a going out from yourself. The Greek theory of vision was that little tiny particles were sent out by the eyes, and as those little tiny particles came and bounced off something, the object was thus formed. And we literally saw because the little particles coming from our eyes bouncing off made that. A kind of a graphic, simple radar. These eyes are not doing that. They're not seeing anything. They're not sending anything out. What they're doing is they're making a pool of receptivity that allows for what is out there to come in, not as an image, but as its reality. And so on the existential level, we look to see something, but on the essential level, we let our lookingness receive the real. And vision is the world picture that occurs from that receptive seeing. So ipopteia was always blended together with a second function, which was called in Greek sympatheia, sympathy. One became a part of that real. Understand? When you allowed that reality to come in and register on you, it didn't register just in the eyes, it went through the eyes. Do you get it? It went through the eyes. Where? Into the soul. Now, when you looked on that level, on the existential level of you looking through your eyes, your psychic form was the form of your body. Existentially, the psychic reverberation of someone was their body. You would have a psychic double, which would be your body in an ethereal form. That's on the existential level. That's on the level of you looking out and seeing. But when you opened yourself up, when you had epopteia, when you were wide-eyed and you let a reality come in to you, then your psychic form changed. And so the whole Greek word for that form, that energy form which was changed, was psyche. It meant butterfly. It meant that whatever you had been before was but a worm compared to the butterfly. And the very image of the soul was always a butterfly. In the earliest conscious symbols, it's always a butterfly. Literally a butterfly. A small human figure shaped like a butterfly on the brow. They're black-figured Attic vases that are extant, and by next week I'll dig one out and a photograph and show you. This is what it is. So that the winged human form, the angel, was the human form that was there by sympatheia and epopteia. Not there by your function of looking, but there by your function of receiving vision. Now, when you look to see, the dimension that occurs is space. When you are looking to see, space is the basic dimension of apprehending form. Space. But when you receive in vision, space does not count. Again, space does not count. So we can say this in rapid order. Building back up to the point where we have got. We're talking about a difference between seeing, which makes space, and receiving, which makes vision. And we want to have that differentiation now. We want to understand that. We don't want to play hooky. We don't want to be absent. We don't want to miss it. We don't want to not get it. We want to be there attentively to realize that this is one of the great diagonals that separates not only sheep from goats and men from boys and girls from women, but it separates Homo sapiens from all the other species that were here previous to us. This is the dividing threshold. This is the event threshold of our species, that someone is able to do this. Because there is no way that primate species before our particular kind had this capacity. Didn't happen. What's the proof of it? The proof of it is art. There was no art. And a further proof is that there was no history, and a further proof there was no science. And all of those follow quickly upon one another. That is to say, if the process is allowed to unfold, they follow quickly upon one another. But as resistance is kept, they become more and more difficult until they're almost impossibility. Like in our age, we're drowning in a swamp of history. I wrote a poem one time about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and talked about the fetid backwaters of recent history. about human beings being reduced to hung people whose dark bodies were pendant over a vast backwater, a fetid river. Let's lead up to this by another approach. Why another approach? Why not just go on with this? Because vision cannot happen by just continuing to talk about something in a straight line. You have to bring at least one other aspect into play. There has to be a juncture. There has to be an angle of vision. So that you need at least two. At least two. The victory sign of Churchill should be turned 90 degrees here. It's like in the old 1934 version of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Pyramus and Thisbe, and the wall has to have a chink through which to see. It's Shakespeare's Renaissance humor, showing these buffoons, showing the Pythagorean secret of the universe. Well, you can't see through a wall without a chink, says Bottom, played by James Cagney. Thisbe, played by Joe E. Brown. You can't see through a wall unless there's a chink. And what's the chink in Midsummer Night's Dream? The chink is the angle by which a Pythagorean triangle is made. Because that is the first primordial formal shape in the archetypal mind by which one can understand in a realization way the true meaning of visionary form. The Pythagorean triangle, the right triangle, the 3, 4, 5 triangle, is the first trigonometric symbol of a transformed psyche understanding visionary form. And the first time that happened was only about 2,500 years ago. It's very recent, isn't it? Here's our other angle of approach. The other angle of approach has to do with our educational form. I recently showed an outline of the program to the provost of UCLA because they're working on a 2-year program, and he didn't see it. He thought it was a great books program, much like they have at the University of Chicago or St. John's or someplace like that. Oh, a great books program. No. Shades of G.E. Moore, right? No. We always take, if you will look at it, it's very graphic, every goddamn time. Every goddamn time. There's not a book, but there's a pair of books. I know that's difficult to see. It's like that Kodiak bear. But you all better count on it turning and running. That's Hollywood talk. So maybe the Kodiak should stand up and growl once in a while. Paired texts are like the paired fingers of Pyramus and Thisbe. It's deceptively simple. It's outrageously refined. Behind it, it's like 100-foot tidal wave. What does it mean? Here's a page, and I'll just read it out so that you can at least just hear it. And then at some time in the future, when I'm gone, you can make copies of the page and just, pin it up. Called paired texts. Paired texts. No matter how many herbs, spices, vegetables, whatnot the soup will have but one taste. All those ingredients combine to only one taste. This is the integral nature of existence. Existential manifestations, things, are what they are. Individual extents, no matter how many elements on the atomic level, a molecule will have but one molecular structure. All those ingredients, one molecular structure only. A single book is like the one taste, the one molecular structure. Movements, no matter how many pressures, aspects, etc., will have but one vector. One vector only. A resultant of combined forces happens. A single book is like the one vector, a resultant experiential motion. Now that's already a lot. But that's all that can be. That's the ceiling. That's it. That's the magna cum laude, which is already very high. And that was great for the last 2,000 years. That was fantastic. It's not enough. No one is going to cross this ocean of history in that boat. That boat doesn't sail the new seas. And so subconsciously, educators who have the responsibility for hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of millions of dollars in education are saying disparagingly, oh, just a great books program. Yes, that's right. But in order to get to the new, you have to transform the old, not reject it. Let's hear it again. You're not going to have a baby out of used semen and used eggs. You can't purchase them elsewhere. They have to be transformed from what they are to what they can be. So that paired books force a transposition to a different resultant, an angle, not a vector, a transformation to a higher form. The paired vectors create a tensor. In mathematics, that's what it's called, tensor. The new order, the new level of result is a tensor, not a vector. And while a vector has space for its context, it always has space. It always has an XYZ axis of ordinals, coordinates that can be applied. And you can analyze and you can determine with whatever accuracy you need. While a vector has space for its context or condition, which is a causal realm, when you have space as your condition, then causality is determinable. But a tensor has a matrix for its context, transforming spatial contextuality or spatial conditionality, transforming causality into a matrix context, a supracausal realm, which is called consciousness. So transform from space causal conditions to conscious matrix context. This is called vision. Epopteia and sympatheia. Now, one of the difficulties in this transformation is that if you don't transform, if you just go by somebody else's transformation, you carry over into vision the habits of the old seeing. And you build elaborate structures that dear old Madame Blavatsky aptly called metaphysling. All the metaphysling structures that there are illusions. It doesn't matter how famous the person is. It doesn't matter how long the illusion's been going on. Just simply isn't there. It's a reflection on a mental space, which is an imitation of visual space and has no reality whatsoever. And one can prove this to oneself because you can go into an integral mode far enough, deep enough so that they disappear. They're not there. Not only do they no longer record, not only are they not to be found, but when you come out differentially in a visionary mode, conscious mode, you can see that there is no context whatsoever in which they could ever have existed in the first place. That is utterly astounding. Not only are they gone now, but in retrospect, there is no way that they ever could have been real. That's absolutely astonishing with 14 exclamation marks. It's the source of genuine humility. You mean? Yes. You mean all that time, all those people, all that activity, all that effort? Yes. A friend of mine says, "Geez Louise." It's extraordinary. Now, English yogis are very rare, and we've been fortunate to have a couple of real good curmudgeon English yogis in the past few centuries. The first one was a Scot named David Hume. David Hume was very solid, portly Scotsman, good friend of Benjamin Franklin. And he wrote a very large tome to disclose what he had found out about human understanding. And he found that our seeing is discontinuous, not because we have holes in our eyes, but because light has holes in its spectrum. That the energy spectrum of visible light by itself has very, very peculiar discontinuity. This was already several hundred years ago. Can you imagine where we are now? Already several hundred years ago. It brought into play a whole quality of mind which was different from the quality of mind before. The quality of mind before then was seen to be rationalistic in that it was based upon a justifying metaphysic. And some of them were pretty interesting, like Spinoza's rationalization of the universe. Very interesting. What an excursion. God loves Baruch Spinoza. His metaphysical geometry is a wonderland. You can go there forever. But David Hume showed that there was a different mode. They call it now empiricism. Empirical. It meant what's there, and whatever's there, actually there, has to be found there. And if it isn't found there, if it isn't findable, then we can't insist that it is there. And the last figure in the line of the empiricist was Bertrand Russell. And Russell is a very peculiar butterfly because he's not only the last of the empiricists, he's the first logician to understand that logic and mystic are a complementation, and that somehow you have to work with both as a whole, and that really stressed him out. He wrote a book called Mysticism and Logic, which in its day was extremely famous. It was the kind of reading, came out in 1929. And Bertrand Russell's Mysticism and Logic came out a whole generation after he and Alfred North Whitehead had written a 3-volume tome called Principia Mathematica, the greatest intellectual set of volumes since Newton's original Principia Mathematica. Newton showed the kind of roots of an empirical understanding of mathematical form and structure and transformation. The language of expressing that is called calculus. Now, Newton's notation was not as good as Leibniz's notation. We use notation based on Leibniz. But Russell, in Mysticism and Logic, a generation after Principia Mathematica, in chapter 8, has a little section here called The Relation of Sense Data to Physics. Because by this time, like everybody in the 1920s, they were starting to get interested in physics because physics was by that time white hot. Because the empirical basis of transformation is what is there to be found in physics, not metaphysics. Watch yourself, be cautious. Physics. And what he says here, physics is said to be an empirical science based upon observation and experiment. It is supposed to be verifiable, i.e., capable of calculating beforehand results subsequently confirmed by observation and experiment. You take the universal language of higher mathematics and you come up with a theory, and then you look to physics in practice to see whether you can find that or not. Okay? Theory and practice. The Greek theoria and praktike, that pair, notice we're back to pairs again. We're talking about pairs of text still. All this is a digression. All of this is just a digression. The Greek theoria doesn't mean just theory as the colloquial English has it. Theoria meant contemplation. It meant epopeia. It meant sympatheia. It meant letting the real come into you so that you have the vision of it. And then the confirmation was the looking to see. Does the eye cinch what the mind was able to envision? Theory and practice. Not the other way around. I'm sorry. Not the other way around. Excuse me. Science is not based on seeing first and vision later. It's based on vision first and seeing later. One more time. If you don't have vision, you cannot have science. What do you have if you don't have science? You have a metaphysical skew, which the further you go with it, it's just like a golf skew. Once it starts, do you think the ball's going to come back on the fairway? Have you ever seen a slice that doubled back on the fairway? You can observe it. Any fairway in the world, once a slice starts, you know what happens. Science, let's just make it really tight. Science is impossible without having vision first. Now, an education that doesn't teach that way cheats the human population not only out of art and history, but out of science also. It may be an inadvertent theft, but nevertheless, that's what happens. Now, when you don't go forward, what happens? You know that life is always restless. If it can't go forward, then it goes backwards. It regresses. And regressive metaphysics solidifies after a while like old glue. And that's where we are now. We're in a world where all the structures of life are just crummy, old, glued pastiches that don't work because they never did anything real in the first place. They're simply the artifacts of ideologies, and they do not have an empirical base. They do not have any kind of confirmation in terms of consciousness. One of the very first people to write about this kind of thing in a very serious way, just a few years after Russell's Mysticism and Logic, was Karl Mannheim, Ideology and Utopia. He was at the University of Frankfurt am Main, and then he was thrown out by the National Socialist Party. Do you know who they were? The Nazis. And he went to the London School of Economics and published and wrote Ideology and Utopia. The first edition was 1936. Ideologies always promote a false utopia. Why is it false? It's false because it cannot happen, because the whole basis of it is an ideological regression. And paradise doesn't have an ideological regression as its foundation. What does it have as its foundation? It has the vision of the morning stars singing together. If those morning stars are not singing together, there is no way that paradise is going to come into being. There's no way. It cannot happen. It never will happen. In all the infinite billions and trillions of years of possibility, it will never happen. Not even once. Not by accident. Not by beseeching. You can do all the good acts you want forever. It will never happen. This is called waking up. Russell, in Mysticism and Logic, to finish it, talking about observation and experiment cinching what vision has allowed itself to see. Not to see so much, but to vision. One has to have a vision first, and then you look to see by observation and experiment. Russell writes, and he writes so beautifully, what can we learn by observation and experiment? Nothing, so far as physics is concerned, except immediate data of sense. Certain patches of color, sounds, tastes, smells, etc., with certain spatio-temporal relations, space-time relations. Sense data, little patches of it with space-time relations. The supposed contents of the physical world are prima facie very different from these. Molecules have no color. Did you know that? Molecules have no color. Atoms make no noise. Electrons have no taste. He even has an artifact here. Corpuscles do not even smell. This is at a time when the corpuscular theory of matter of J.J. Thomson, still in Britain, in Cambridge especially, was still remembered fondly. If such objects are to be verified, it must be solely through their relation to sense data. They must have some kind of correlation with sense data, and they must be verifiable through their correlation alone. Sympatheia. Correlation. You cannot smear correlation and sympatheia by saying, well, that's magical. Yes, it is magical, and it's absolutely necessary empirically. Absolutely. What does Russell say? But how is the correlation itself ascertained? Excellent question. How is the correlation itself ascertained? By astrological theory? By metaphysics? No. A correlation can only be ascertained empirically by the correlation of objects being constantly found together. You have to be able to find them together. When you find two atoms of hydrogen with an atom of oxygen together, you have a molecule of water. You have to end on a drop of water. Let's come back to Bertrand Russell. Let's come back to mysticism and logic. Let's come back to his point here about sense data and correlation, theory and practice, the practice of observation, the practice of experiment. Why is it that practice tends to want to come first? Because in nature, practice happens first. The observation is a function of existence, the sense data from existence, the ritual level. The experiment, which is the vicissitudes of the play of conditions, is a myth, experience. Ritual and myth come before symbols, before this ability to vision. But notice that the vision doesn't even happen in symbols. The vision happens after. Ritual's in the second quarter, right? Myth is in the third quarter. I mean, you have to get down to counting on your fingers. This is not a great books program. This is structure of DNA. I don't think they're going to give me Nobel Prize, but I know that this is the way. This is the sequence. Rituals in the second quarter, myth is in the third, symbols in the fourth, vision is in the fifth. Vision is always quintessential. It's one way to remember it. Magic, right? Magic is quintessential. Fifth. 5. Why is it 5? Because the hand has 5. There's 4 fingers and a movable thumb. The fifth phase, its mobility allows you to greet and grasp. But you have to greet first before you grasp. It's etiquette, first of all. Do you think St. Peter and St. Paul are going to open the golden gate to you because you grab it? Let me in? No. You have to show some etiquette. Even if there's no respect for the teachers, you have to at least respect Peter and Paul. I mean, they're keeping the gate. Reminds me about the joke about the Rolls Royce. You know, the minister who comes in and they welcome him and they give him a brand new Ford to drive around heaven. He says, well, this is unexpected. This is fantastic. And then sees this priest that he knew drive by in a Mercedes. He says, I get a Ford, and he gets a Mercedes. And Peter says, wait till you see the rabbi's Rolls Royce. You can't get into heaven by storming it. That's the essence of hell. Trying to get into heaven by storm is hell. Hell is nowhere. It's just the attempt to get into heaven by storm is hell. Russell says here something that's extremely important, and it has its reverberations. If objects are to be verified, if the practice of verification, if objects are to be verified, it must be solely through their relation to sense data. It's the only existential way that observation would actually occur, and the correlation of that with experience is the only way that the vicissitudes and various variables could be brought into a formal relationship. They must have some kind of correlation with sense data and must be verifiable through their correlation alone. But how is the correlation itself ascertained? A correlation can only be ascertained empirically by the correlated objects being constantly found together. But, we didn't get to this before the break, but in our case, only one term of the correlation, namely the sensible term, is ever found. The other term seems essentially incapable of being found. The title of the book is Mysticism and Logic. Only one part of the essential correlation can be found because it is the only part that is findable. The other part, like the dark matter of the universe, is not findable. But its correlation still holds. How do we know that? Because we can prove it logically and mathematically. Because the findable verification, the sense data part of the correlation, which is findable and alone is findable, very often uncareful investigators, scientists, physicists, mathematicians have made the mistaken assumption then that sense data is the determining aspect and is the whole correlation. It's a very peculiar situation. And it leads very naturally to choosing the prominent vector, and the whole regressive aspect comes into play, and there's no visionary chink through which to see. Now, many people carp about this and rail against this, and it's been pointed out several 100,000 times in our century. And the beat goes on. For Russell, a generation after mysticism and logic, the problem had become exacerbated to the point to where he realized that the whole crux of humanity being garroted by its own intrinsic ignorance was the threat to existence, to life itself. And so he wrote a book called Authority and the Individual in 1949, one of the world's really great books. He wrote it extempore. He was so brilliant. By the time Lord Russell was, how old was he? He was 89. He was really somebody. And in Authority and the Individual, it's so beautifully written that you could read the topic sentence of every paragraph all the way through and get the book. And at the very center of the book, sections 3 and 4, the role of individuality, the conflict of technique and human nature. We'll put it over here with ideology and utopia. And between 1936 and 1949, the world had a tremendous trauma. Because in 1936, the problem was with the Nazis or with the communists, but the problem in 1949 was suddenly the hydrogen bomb. Because the very same peril that let sociological psychopaths like Nazis and Stalinist communists inhabit humanity on hundreds of millions was at work in the hydrogen bomb. And Russell spent the rest of his life, the last 8 years of his life, trying to alert everyone to this catastrophic situation. It's not that nuclear weapons are so much the problem, it's that the way in which we don't envision the wholeness of life, they are eventually going to happen. Because he said once in a fantastic, impassioned plea, he was, I think he was about 95 years old, and he was just sort of still frail and trembling, but he managed to just put his courage into it and say it like a champion. He said, man has never made a weapon that he hasn't used. And used, and used, and used, and used. And man will not survive unless he transforms. There's no way. Two powers caught up in a Peloponnesian War archetype will refrain from using nuclear weapons because of mutual deterrence of terror. But eventually, the fear of them will wane away. The proliferation of them will create the structure. And eventually, it will be what the threat has always been, unless man changes. Man has to transform, not into something new, not into some unheard of metaphysical, angelic UFO being. We're already way beyond that. We're way, way beyond that already. Our reality is completely transcendent to that. All those metaphysical things are adolescent dreams. But the fact is that there's no way to get to an accurate, observable experience, so confirmation, until we have vision first. Now, why is this? Why is it that vision comes first? Doesn't it come, you said quintessential, right? Yep, that's right. Let's look at the secret. Let's hold the hand up and let's look just like Paleolithic man could look, but he couldn't see. The Kodiak bear was there, but he couldn't see. But somehow he still had that deep archetypal quality that was in play and allowed him to function with the mystery even though he didn't know it. He knew enough to shut up and to do it even though he couldn't say. And in order to understand this, where did our education begin? Because you have to go back to the beginning. You always have to go back to the beginning. It doesn't matter how chaotic a situation is. If you go back to the beginning point, you can characterize exactly what is findable and what is not findable, both, if one is assiduous. The very beginning, we began with the I Ching. There it is. Nature 1, the I Ching. Now, everybody talks about the I Ching in terms of yin and yang. That is an artifact of later Chinese thought. The I Ching moves by a 5-phase energy cycle, which, frankly, ignores yin and yang. Come again. Very difficult, because erudite things like Jung's commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower are all about, well, yin and yang, right? The diagram at the very end of it. Tao up here, yin and yang. Then Meng and Xing. Then anima and animus. Yeah? Little diagrams. It's all an illusion. First of all, it has nothing to do with Chinese development in history of ideas. Nothing to do whatsoever. If you read the Tao Te Ching, and I just finished a translation of it, word for word, every damn word, the Chinese characters for yin and yang do not appear in the Tao Te Ching. Now you can try that on for size. Lao Tzu, whose Tao Te Ching is the angle of vision by which to see the I Ching, does not refer to yin and yang once. Well, okay, a good question is, where does yin and yang come from then? Let's digress for a moment. The best place to come to that digression is Joseph Needham, Science and Civilization in China, Volume 1. There's about 20 volumes now. 1954. Somewhere in here, page 96, I thought it was. Yeah, here it is. Page 96, Historical Introduction. There was Su Yan, the nature philosopher and founder of the Yin-Yang school. And then there were other Taoists and so forth. Su Yan, the nature philosopher and founder of the Yin-Yang school. Imagine that. There was a founder of a Yin-Yang school in Chinese philosophy. Feng Yulan, History of Chinese Philosophy, translated by Dirk Bode, Princeton University Press, 1949. Volume 2, page 131, Chinese Philosophy, under Prognostication, Text, Apocrypha, Numerology, Section 9, The Yin-Yang School and Science. Whoa. Through the yin-yang theories, it's hard to read, isn't it? So, through the yin-yang theories, thus came to embrace many absurdities. What a way to begin, right? Geez, we thought yin yang was the height of Chinese wisdom, and already the Chinese histories of philosophy knew. Oh, when did they first know this? They knew this about 2,000 years ago already. Can you imagine that? So that Western metaphysical thinkers about new Taoist stuff are already 2,000 years out of date in terms of Chinese history. Can you imagine that? Now, how much money have you spent on these Taoist classics recently? Though the yin-yang theories thus came to embrace many absurdities, they at the same time contained the beginnings of Chinese science. What I mean by this is that underlying all the yin-yang thinking was the fundamental aim of creating a truly inclusive system of thought, a system which would embrace and explain the phenomena of the entire universe. The phenomena of the entire universe. Granted that its methodology was faulty and its data inadequate, it was nevertheless scientific in spirit in its desire to organize and systematize universal phenomenon and to know their why and wherefore. In the environment of political unification of the Qin and Han dynasties, it is not surprising that men were inspired to seek a corresponding ideological unification of the universe as well. Now, Su Yan lived about 350 BC, and the Yin-Yang school came into play about 350 to about 300 BC. And it was one of many. But when the Qin dynasty was founded, and the Qin is from where we get the term Chinese, before the Qin they weren't Chinese. They didn't call themselves Chinese at all. Did you know that? They didn't. It was only after the Qin that they called themselves Chinese. It's easy to remember because the founder of the Qin built the Great Wall. The Great Wall of China is a symbol of the dichotomous mind and mentality that ruined China. Because under an ideological, utopic grasping, they settled only for what you could have. Power always settles for what you can have, what you can get. It's called booty. Not the kind of booties that babies wear. It's only what you can grasp. That's all that counts. Now, the founder of the Qin was, he's a little grandiose, right? He couldn't make it stick. But behind them was a whole power structure of people, very powerful, all men. And they said, he has a good idea, but he's just not doing it right. Let's us get together and we'll do it right. And so immediately upon the death of the founder of the Qin dynasty, a new dynasty was founded called the Han. They said, yes, we're Chinese, we're Chinese, but this is the final dynasty. The Han will be the final dynasty. And the Han Chinese are the Romans of the Far East. They're contemporaneous with the Roman Empire. In fact, the one reason why Han China and the Roman Empire never went any further east or west is because they ran into each other and they realized that they're equally tough. Equally tough. The Han Chinese decided that the way to have political power cinched and grasped was on the basis of a yin-yang school of thought, beginning of looking at the I Ching in a yin-yang way and going through a whole cycle of indoctrination that ended up with verifying whether or not you saw the I Ching in terms of yin-yang. And this whole process of beginning and ending with the I Ching and cinching it through graspable, factual indoctrination was the Chinese civil servant system. And no one got a job of any importance, of any decision making, until you took the Chinese civil service exam. And the Han Chinese set that into motion about 200 BC, and it lasted until 1911. Now, the only reason it didn't last after that is dynastic China fell apart. And a lot of the so-called red Chinese communists today are trying to form a new dynasty and making the communist ideology the new version of the Chinese civil servant system. And it just is not going to happen. It's not going to work. It never will work. Once a form that generates illusion has been broken, it never again has the power to enchant. Never. It'll never happen. Feng Yulan also has here a very interesting, in section 1, under the 100 schools. Remember I said that the yin-yang school was one of a great number. They call that period the 100 schools period. Remember Mao Zedong had the 100 flowers period? It was a replay of this. Let 100 different doctrines blossom. 100 schools. So here in volume 1 of Feng Yulan's History of Chinese Philosophy, Zhou Yan and the School of Yin-Yang and of the 5 elements. 5 elements. Notice that the Taoist 5-phase energy cycle has been reduced and solidified to 5 elements. Not 5 phases of dynamic, but 5 elements of a static structure. We could go on with this. We don't need to go on with this. Let's retract, let's go back, because in the Tao Te Ching, the angle of vision is all understanding how the 5-phase energy cycle happens. It begins with Tao, it goes through Te, through Zhen, through Yi, through Li, and back to Tao. And as long as that circulation happens, Qi is real. Long as that ecology works, life happens. If it gets stopped up in any kind of degree, there's a backup of energy right there. So that the human body has all these energy flows, and as long as they flow, the human body is easily and naturally transforms itself back into Tao. But whenever there's an impedance of any kind, that no longer happens and resistances happen, so you have to open up. You have to open up those points. And they're talked about as meridians, but there's nowhere that there are physiological meridians. They're not there. Oh yeah, they're on the charts. Yes, they are. And they're there when you make the pressure points. But it's like Russell's mysticism and logic. The actual meridians do not exist. They are not findable. Even though they happen, they're not findable. Even though the correlation is true, they're not findable. Now, there are lots of Chinese doctors gathering shekels and disciples by saying that they know where those meridians are. Oh, it gets much worse. You know this better than I do. You've paid them, right? I never pay them. In the 5-phase energy cycle, Only by starting with one can you have two. Only with one preceding it can you have two. And the flaw, the mistaken methodology in the yin-yang school was to say that Tao is one, and there the next stage is yin-yang, which is two. Whereas in the I Ching, in the Tao Te Ching, in all of Chinese history up until the founding of the Qin dynasty, Tao is always zero-based. Te is one, but Tao is zero. Zero. As long as the thumb is a zero base, the hand will not only be able to grasp, but be able to greet. If you make the error, the flaw of beginning with one instead of zero, if you begin with a one as your base, you can grasp, but you cannot greet. The reflex to greet doesn't happen. The reflex instead is to clench even tighter on graspability. That's called grasping at straws. The clenching of the fist is a regression. Once Gandhi heard some people chanting Kranti, 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 revolution in Hindi. Kranti, Kranti. He said, you better just say it once. That's already too much. Scrunching your fist, trying to clench it even harder, which is the essence of progress in power. And in sense data, just completely seals you off from the correlation that's there by the ungraspable greeting. And the only way to do that is to remember that the energy cycle begins with zero. It's a zero base. An algorithmic logic that operates indefinitely, infinitely, has a zero base. And when it does, its functioning is pristine. Pristine. Now, this is not only true in terms of mathematics, it's true in terms of the logical structure of the human mind. The great genius in the human history of this planet who first was able to express that accurately in a discursive language was a man in India who lived about 100 AD named Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna was the great logical genius who founded the whole concept of zero in mathematics. It occurs in India first as an expressive language symbol whose functioning is rational and realistic and correlatable. Even though one cannot grasp zero, its functioning contributes to an order which is graspable, confirmable, observable, and thus empirical. If you do not remember to begin with zero, then the whole thing about the hand becomes such that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you end up with the quintessence being on what the Chinese call the 10,000 things, the world. If you make Tao one, then what you're grasping is the world, because it's the final stage. It's what all this is about, isn't it? Is to have things. To have things. These are mine. They're mine. And that's mine. You get the point. It's an illusion. Samsara. Not only doesn't it happen, it never has happened. It seems almost impossible when one thinks back of the billions of human beings who have grasped, possessed, owned, deeded. You mean all? Yes. That's amazing. Yes, it's astonishing, truly. That's why when you first enter heaven, it's just such a vast silence that your ears hurt. No promotions, no advertisements, no claims. If you begin with 0, then the quintessence of it is, watch, 1, te, 2, gen, 3, e, things of the mind. 4, the quintessence is where? There isn't another place here. It's back to Tao. So that Tao becomes the quintessence. It's the 0 beginning, but it becomes the quintessence, the 5th place. The return to Tao becomes the 5th place, becomes the thumb. It becomes vision. You let nature be 0 base, and vision becomes the quintessence. And it runs nature, ritual, myth, symbol, vision. And you have that 5-phase energy cycle. And when they're together, when they happen, when that form is there, that form is a mystical prism through which the manifest light of this universe discloses the spectrum of what is observable and shows the discontinuities that are also real, that are not observable, but nevertheless operate. They count. And only by taking them into account in any operable application does one then have something that's real. The question, is anything real? Yes. Many, many, many things are real. It's not all illusion in the sense that everything is illusion, but everything done in this illusory manner just simply doesn't have any real existence. It only happens as long as the lie continues, which is why the devil is called the liar. He has a vested interest. His demons have vested interest in keeping lies going. They have to, because that's their only guarantee that the show is going to go on. Because the moment that lying stops, their whole reality no longer happens. And once it happens, once it's broken, it can never be established again. Not ever. Why? Because it was never established in the first place. The victory of God is so complete. I don't want to alienate you by a little religious sermon. If you're squeamish about it, tune it out. What does it say? In Arabic, in all sizes, on every mosque, it says only one sentence. There's no victor but Allah. Over and over again, because that's all that one can say. There is no victor but Allah. Because once illusion is broken, not only does it cease, but it also has never been. One says, well, what happens? Well, very often people find themselves absolutely speechless before a universal silence. And sometimes there aren't enough years to just weep quietly at the embarrassment and chagrin of having been so huffy and pushy over nothing. Sound and fury signifying nothing. Is so catastrophic that the ego will not let you voluntarily. The ego will not voluntarily let this realization happen. Anything but that. Anything. Eventually, it will prefer anything, even Nazism, even Stalinist, even nuclear destruction of all life. It will go that far. It would erase life from the planet before it would allow this to happen. And this is one of the secrets of the universe. That's why there is an unobservable, it isn't observable at all, component in correlation. It's there to guarantee that no one will ever grasp in the wrong way and get it and have it. The fruit of the other tree is not findable. It's there, but not findable. And that's not a paradox. It's not only that the fruit is there, but unfindable. The tree is there, but unfindable. But the tree and the fruit operate in the correlation of vision in such a way that their reality is indisputable. So that paired text, and this is where we started in the morning, not a great books course. Go back in line and begin again. Go back to Nature 1, but you see somebody who has not gone through this process of refinement would never know that. Why? Because the inexpertise of false education is such that under that aegis, this is not knowable. At least minimally, half of the sense of this educational process is undiscoverable. It lives in the undiscoverable country, the undiscovered country. It is there when you need to count on it for reality, but it's not there to get. It is extraordinary. And in 30 years of trying to put together a form of continuity that would disclose this to enormous population, it's not enough to have 1 or 2 or 10 or 100 people get it. It has to be gotten by at least 100, 200 million people at a time. But there's a generation of enough people to do something to help life, because life needs help. Mother Nature needs help. Not having a very good time. She needs to have a conscious dimension. She needs to have a trigonometric function brought into play so that the planet as a sphere can be whole. Not maps which are flat and are carvable into political colored sections like a puzzle. The planet is not a map. And it's not just on the level of Korzybski saying the map is not the territory. It's the ungraspable correspondence. Yes, thank you. Alfred's kudos. It's the ungraspable reality aspect which has to be brought into correspondence. And that can only be done by invitation. One has to prepare oneself to be inviting to the mysterious to show itself. You have to comb your hair. Yeah, all those things. Fingernails. You have to be likable, lovable, presentable, inviting, and then that mysterious, mystical correspondence to logic happens. And then one sees. The recognition happens. Recognition. So that Plato was very right. And in the Phaedo, he goes to enormous lengths to, in a beautiful, elegant way, stage a play, a philosophic dialogue play, so that one can understand that education consciously is recognition, recognition. Something which you had seen already, but now is only visionable, and only when after it's visionable can you go back and then see it for what it was. Science is the taking of vision and recognizing what nature was all about. So science is very, very, very close to nature, but in the sense of returning to nature to know and to understand. That's the cosmos. And that cosmos is real. If you look at the cover of Time magazine today on the newsstands, that's what's in the news. It's cover news. Right now, the planet has the shuttle going around it and 4 astronomers on it to determine through very high sophisticated astrophysics the fact that the ungraspable dark matter, so-called, of the universe actually functions in a way which the math in theory actually shows. The theoria is very clear. It's extraordinarily clear. It's that the practice, the observation and experiment, is so elusive because as long as one insists on simply sense data, one's going to miss it. Fortunately, there are enough people now sensitive enough to be able to realize that there's something not quite right, but the education is so far remiss. The education system is at least 300 years out of date. Can you imagine? 300 years out of date. If we put a Manhattan Project into play now, it would take at least 10 to 15 years to get an educational system up to speed to where it could function on enough of a scale to be effective. And it would take at least half a dozen years for even the brightest series of people to come to be. We're at least a generation away from there even being a ground of getting to square one where somebody could begin to do something. But the Chinese proverb is quite true. Even a journey of 1,000 miles has to begin with a single step. One simply has to be practical about it, that the only way that that vision of the real actually is real is that one has to walk it. The old Indian prayer, before I criticize another human being, let me walk a mile in his moccasins. And once you have walked in the way in which that human being walks, the enormous humility that is simply apparent of how difficult it is to be real as a human being, given these disadvantages, given these flaws, which are not only built in, but supported and underlined and underscored, and all the good things come to you supposedly because you go that way. All that has to be not just relinquished, but to be held so lightly that the hand is empty when it holds itself up. The eyes have to be empty, all they can see. Black Elk said it's in the dark of men's eyes that they become lost. And right where one would see freedom, one sees nothing. Even if it's a Kodiak bear right in front of you. More next week.